In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Maebel's Scarlet. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. It runs dry, I don't know why. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate this ink, I hate this ink. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. It hard starts constantly. Every time I turn around, I have to reprime the pen. I generally ink the pens a few days before I actually do the writing sample so that I don't have a super saturated feed. I had to clean the pens out. It was having a real problem. This ink just comes across to me as a constant train wreck. It's very distracting to use. Excuse me. Because I have to really pay attention to the nib on the paper because it stops writing. And I have to spend more time paying attention to the fact of, is ink going down, that I can't pay attention to what I'm actually putting on the page. So, second verse, same as the first. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. I hate this ink, I hate this ink. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. But let's take a look at, let's try when the writing samples come up to see what is actually there, other than that I hate it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Waterman Graduate with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we see a light red. It has no feather. It has no spread. There is a couple of moments of shading that do happen. It is there. This is certainly not the red for me. Now, the medium nib is in general darker than we got with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get some shading. This not being a red for me is more about the tone at this point. I'm going to keep those other opinions aside. I hate it. But it's just, I don't care for shading in red. And the medium is shading quite a bit. Or it's running dry and then getting some flow back. I'm not sure. Looking at the stub nib, you see that it's about the same tone that we got with the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get some shading. I really do think it looks the best here out of these three. If it wrote with consistent flow, I would consider this in this stub nib. I don't think this is too bad. I consider this kind of okay. Much more impressed with it right here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no feather and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we see that it is a very, very light red. It's not horrible, but it looks a little washed out. It almost looks kind of sun-bleached. Now, we're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We do get a little bit of some shade that does show up in some areas. Like, you'll see it in there on the left side, they on the left side, reach on the left side. You see it in sometimes right in the middle. So it is there. The medium nib is certainly darker than we had with the fine. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We get, I'm going to call it dots of shading from time to time. But other than that, no real shading. And this is the beginning of where you'll see I start having some flow issues going on with this pen. And I just chose not to cut them out. Looking at the stub nib, it is about the same tone that we got with the fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does have a little bit of shading that comes through, which typically stub nibs are going to go ahead and allow us to get more of that shading, and here we do get some, so it's doing good for that, but you saw there was flow problems and a fight with the pen. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get almost no ghosting. We get a little bit that goes on in the medium, nothing in the fine or the stub, but we get no bleed through. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it's a light red, but on this paper I think it looks fairly good. We don't get any kind of feathering, we don't get any kind of spread, we don't get any kind of shading. It went very well here. It was a very pleasant writing experience in this case. The fine nib seems to be handling it the very best here. Looking at the medium nib, we see that it's darker than we had with the fine. We do see tiny bits of feathering. We do maybe have a tiny bit of spread, but really not any kind of a problem. I don't want to say that there's shading, but you will see areas where it is definitely lighter. And I don't think that's shading. I think that's flow issues that this ink is having. Almost makes me wish that I was still testing viscosities. Looking at the stub nib, we see that we get no real feathering, we get no real spread, we get a lot of flow issues, we see a lot of frustration on my side trying to get this pen to write, and then I just say crap and move on. This is bad. Looking at the back of the page, the only spots that came through were actually where I was shaking the pen to get some ink to actually come out of it, so a larger dot went down. Other than that, we had no bleeding or ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a national Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, this is a very light red. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We do get 1 or 2 darker spots which do occur. I will reiterate that it seems that this fine nib is the best one handling this ink. Looking at the medium in general, it looks a bit darker than what we had with the fine. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. This paper generally handles ink fairly well. We're not really getting anything for shading. I know we see shading there. I'm going to call this an issue where the pen runs dry and then gets flow back, more than that it shades. Looking at the stub nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the medium. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get shading, and I'm going to say that here because largely I didn't run into a lot of flow issues in this particular one, so maybe it is shading, maybe it's a flow problem. Looking at the back of the page, you see the spot that I circled. That spot came through, touched the page underneath. Now, other than that, where I do find that this ink causes you to want to press a little bit harder because you feel like you're not getting the flow. So that may have been a user error. Other than that, this is pretty good. No bleeding, no real ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 9. Here is KWZ Grapefruit. Here is Noodler's Alamo's Twilight. Here is Sailor Irori. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, this is a very, very light red. We get no feather, no spread. We get a couple of darker areas in some of the writing, and I will go ahead and call it some shading here because this pen has not had any real problem in writing, and when I was scratching out the word difficulties in the third line, that was more me being frustrated this whole time using this ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the fine. We're not really getting any feather. We're not getting any spread. Again, we get areas that look like they're shading, but you see in the middle there where I started to run into some issues with flow. So is it shading or is it having flow problems? I really can't say. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it's a little bit darker in general than we had with the medium. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get shading or a flow problem. You get to choose whichever that one's going to be. This has been the most frustrating review that I've done, and I am so thankful that it's over. Oh my God, one more writing sample to go. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get almost no ghosting, so it did really well there, and we get no bleed through. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Sailor, their gentle C'est Beaucoup. Here is a gray ink by Bookbinders, their Ground Rattler Snake. Here is a blue ink by Diatramensis, Christopher Columbus Atlantic Blue. Here is a black ink by Blackstone, Barrister Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we see that we really almost get no feathering. We get almost no spread. It did incredibly well on this paper. Now, we do see spots that look like shading that I'm not calling shading anymore. I'm really considering it to be a flow issue with this ink, even though this pen has typically done very well. I'd say this on this paper is pretty good. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had with the fine. There are tiny feathers in a couple spots. I'm going to let those go because this ink has whole other problems. We do get a tiny bit of spread. We do get moments of shading, aka flow problems. It's not too bad, though, in general, as long as you can keep the pen writing. Looking at the stub nib, we see that it's about the same tone that we had with the medium. We get no feather, no spread, so truly remarkable for this paper. We get shading, aka flow issues. You see it a lot. Thank God this is over. I hate it. As the absolute bright part of this, looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding that comes through to the other side, and the ghosting is, for this paper, fairly minimal, almost non-existent considering this paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Finding a pen that this would work best in is quite difficult, but I really have narrowed it down and found the perfect answer. And that is somebody else's pen, preferably someone you don't like, right before they take their test or have to deal with any kind of important document. If it's your enemy and you were to do this, you could truly sabotage everything in their future. Don't do that. It would be bad karma for the universe. It's horrible. I wouldn't put it in a pen ever again. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.